On August 7, 1944, a Hauptmann in the 2nd Panzer Division named Werner Kortenhaus sat in the cupola of a Panther tank on the outskirts of Mortain, France, and watched something he could not explain. His column had rolled into position before dawn. 4 German armored divisions, over 200 tanks, the largest German counterattack in the West since the landings, and Kortenhaus had believed, genuinely believed, that it would work. Mortain was lightly defended. The Americans had stretched themselves thin in Patton's breakout. A hard drive west through this gap would cut the American supply lines and reach the sea at Avranches. Hitler had ordered it. The generals had planned it. And in the dark hours before first light, it had actually begun to look possible. Then the sun came up. What Kortenhaus saw when the fog lifted was not the collapse of an American defense. It was something quieter and far more disturbing. A single American infantryman was visible on the slope above town, crouched in a shallow hole in the ground, with what appeared to be a radio. He was not firing, he was talking. Within minutes, the world came apart. The shells did not arrive with any warning that Kortenhaus could process. There was no buildup of sound, no visible aircraft, no muzzle flash from any direction he could identify. The rounds simply appeared, accurately, in the middle of his column, and they did not stop. He later wrote that it felt as though an invisible hand were reaching down from the sky and crushing whatever it wanted. His tank survived that morning. Dozens of vehicles around him did not. That soldier in the hole was a forward observer. He was 20 years old. His name was Robert Weiss, and what he was doing in that foxhole on the hill above Mortain would have been, by the standards of any other army in the war, completely impossible. If this kind of story matters to you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. This video is about American artillery. Not the guns themselves, not the shells or the calibers or the ranges. Those things matter, and we will get to them. But this is really a story about something far more profound. It is about a system that the United States Army built before the war, in a classroom in Oklahoma, that gave every American platoon the ability to call down the firepower of an entire battalion in less than 3 minutes. A system so fast, so accurate, and so lethal that German prisoners of war, men who had fought through Poland and France and the Eastern Front, men who understood war in ways that most people alive today never will, struggled to believe what they were seeing was real. The Germans never called it the hand of God in those words. What they called it was different, depending on who was writing and when. But the feeling behind those words, that sense of something vast and invisible and completely beyond their ability to locate or suppress or counter, that feeling was documented in after-action reports and prisoner interrogations and private letters throughout the war. And the reason they could not counter it was not a failure of courage or intelligence or military skill. The reason they could not counter it was that copying the American artillery system would have required them to dismantle something that had been at the center of military thinking in Europe for a century, and they could not bring themselves to do it. But to understand why, we need to go back to before the war even started, back to a place called Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the early 1930s, and a problem that no army on Earth had yet solved. The problem was simple to state, and nearly impossible to fix. How do you mask the fire of multiple artillery batteries on a single target quickly enough to matter? Artillery had been a decisive weapon in the First World War. Everybody knew that. What everybody also knew was how slowly it worked. In 1917, calling in an artillery fire mission on an enemy position was a laborious process. The observer identified the target. He reported it up the chain of command. The command passed the request to a fire coordination element. The fire coordination element calculated the data separately for each battery. Each battery commander received his own instructions, made his own adjustments, and fired. The whole process could take 30 minutes or more, and by the time the shells landed, the target had often moved. Infantry that was pinned down or under assault did not have 30 minutes. Infantry that was being overrun did not have 10. The U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had been wrestling with this problem since the 1920s. The man who cracked it, or at least cracked it first, was a major named Carlos Brewer. Brewer was the director of gunnery at Fort Sill in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And he was the kind of officer who thought about fire coordination the way an engineer thinks about a machine. Every inefficiency in the process was a gear that needed replacing. Every delay was a design flaw. What Brewer proposed was radical in its simplicity. Instead of computing firing data separately at each battery and coordinating from the top down, He proposed centralizing the computation at the battalion level. A single element, what would eventually become the Fire Direction Center, would receive the observer's report, compute the data for all batteries simultaneously, and transmit firing commands to every gun at once. The batteries would no longer be running separate calculations. They would be executing a single solution, all at the same time. In the spring of 1931, Brewer's gunnery department demonstrated massed battalion fire using this method on the ranges at Fort Sill. 12 howitzers, 1 target, 1 computation, simultaneous. The results were so far ahead of what the traditional method could produce that the demonstration changed the direction of American artillery doctrine for the next decade. Brewer's successor was a major named Orlando Ward. Ward took Brewer's concept and built it into an actual organizational structure between 1932 and 1934. He gave it a name, a table of organization, a set of procedures, the Fire Direction Center. Every artillery battalion would have one. It would be the brain of the battalion, and most critically, it would be connected, by radio, to every forward observer in front of it. Hold that detail in your mind, the radio connection. It matters more than anything else in this story. The graphic firing table, introduced in 1939, made the FDC's calculations faster. A specially designed plotting board let operators convert an observer's report into firing data in seconds, rather than minutes. 2 operators worked the board simultaneously, one maintaining the primary chart and one maintaining a backup, so that a single radio hit or a stray shell could not destroy the calculation mid-mission. Redundancy was built into the architecture of the thing from the beginning, and the lightweight FM radio, which the U.S. Army adopted for ground use partly through the advocacy of an officer named Anthony McAuliffe, who had studied Connecticut State Police radio equipment, gave the FDC the communication net it needed to function under combat conditions. McAuliffe's insight was not glamorous. It was that a clear radio signal over 40 miles was more valuable, tactically, than almost anything else you could put on a truck. The SCR-609 and the SCR-610, the battery-powered field radios that connected observers to fire direction centers, were unglamorous pieces of equipment. They were heavy. They required careful tuning. The crystals that controlled their frequencies were fragile, but they worked in the Normandy hedgerows, and they worked in the Ardennes snow, and they worked on the slopes of Hill 314 when everything else had been cut off or destroyed. The system was complete by the time the United States entered the war. Not perfect, not fully tested at scale, but complete. Beyond the mechanics, there was something else built into the FDC concept that is easy to overlook. The system created pre-registered firing points called concentrations. Before a battle began, before any shot was fired in anger, the forward observers and the FDC would together identify every piece of terrain in the observation zone that might become tactically significant. A road junction, a river crossing, a reverse slope behind an orchard, a field that tanks would have to cross to reach the next village. Each of these was assigned a number and plotted precisely on the firing chart. When the battle started and a target appeared, the observer did not need to give a grid reference and wait for the FDC to plot it from scratch. He gave a concentration number. The FDC already had the data. The guns were already laid on it. This meant that the most common fire missions took not 3 minutes, but under 1. What it meant in practice was this. A forward observer, a young officer or sometimes a sergeant, positioned himself as far forward as possible. He had a radio, a map, a pair of binoculars, and a set of pre-computed reference points called concentrations, numbered barrage points that had already been plotted on the FDC's firing chart. When he identified a target, he called the FDC on the radio. He gave his observer identification, his concentration number or a grid reference, and the type of fire he wanted. The FDC plotted the target, computed the data for all batteries simultaneously, and transmitted fire commands to the gun line. The guns fired. The observer adjusted. The FDC updated the data for every battery in real time, and when the observer on the ground could not see the target, there was an observer in the air. Every American Field Artillery Battalion in the European theater was issued 2 Piper L4 Cubs, tiny, single-engine aircraft that looked like something a civilian flying club would park behind a farmhouse. They were not combat aircraft in any meaningful sense. They carried no weapons and had no armor. They cruised at about 80 miles an hour, low and slow over the battlefield, the pilots leaning out the window with binoculars and a radio. German fighter pilots occasionally shot them down as a matter of sport or irritation. But the L4s were so numerous, so easy to replace, and so capable of directing artillery with a precision that ground observers could not match, that by the summer of 1944, they had become, in the estimate of American artillery commanders, the single most effective component of the entire fire support system. A ground observer in a hedgerow might see 300 meters in any direction on a good day. An L4 pilot at 1,500 feet could see the entire divisional sector. He could watch a German column moving toward the front from 10 miles out. He could identify camouflaged positions that were invisible from the ground. He could adjust artillery fire with a clear view of both the target and the shell bursts simultaneously, which made his corrections faster and more accurate than anything achievable from a foxhole. German commanders feared the L4s with an intensity that far exceeded their fear of most American combat aircraft. A P-47 could destroy what it saw. An L4 could destroy everything within range of every howitzer it was talking to. The only way to stop it was to shoot it down. And shooting it down was hard, because by the time you had found it and aimed at it, you had already been on its radio for 30 seconds. From first call to first rounds on target, the process took roughly 3 minutes. 3 minutes. The German system, which we will examine in detail, was taking 10 minutes at minimum for a single battery, and significantly longer to mass fire from multiple batteries. The Americans could have an entire battalion of 12 howitzers firing on a target before a German battalion had finished routing its request through the first command layer. When multiple battalions were massed, and they frequently were, the gap became something that German artillery officers struggled to describe coherently in their after-action reports. There was one more technique layered on top of all of this, and it was perhaps the most psychologically devastating thing American artillery could do to a German formation. It was called time on target. The mechanics were precise. The FDC coordinated the firing schedules of multiple batteries and sometimes multiple battalions, so that shells fired from different distances at different times all arrived at the target grid within seconds of each other. A battery 5 miles from the target fired before a battery 3 miles away, calculated so that both salvos landed simultaneously. The effect was not simply more explosions. It was the elimination of the warning gap. When shells arrived in sequence, a trained soldier had a chance. He heard the first rounds, he identified the incoming direction, he moved. Human reflexes, trained by months in the field, could buy a man 10 or 15 seconds. That was enough to get low, to find cover, to survive what would otherwise be a lethal fragment pattern. Time on target closed that gap entirely. When every shell in every battery arrived within 3 seconds of each other, there was no warning to respond to. The sky simply detonated, and whatever was in the target zone at that moment did not move in time. German prisoners described this technique with a consistency that military historians have noted across dozens of separate interrogation records. They could not explain it. They did not know it had a name. What they knew was that sometimes the American artillery gave no warning, and sometimes it gave some warning, and they could never predict which it would be. And that unpredictability, that absence of any learnable pattern to survive by, was what broke men who had survived everything else the war had put in front of them. But the system was only as good as the man at the front end of it. And this is where the American approach did something that no other army in the war had fully committed to. They trusted 20-year-olds. Frank Denius was born in Athens, Texas in 1926. He was the son of a dry goods merchant. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1943 at the age of 17, having persuaded his father to sign the consent form by pointing out that he would be drafted anyway once he turned 18. He was trained as a fire control instrument operator in the Field Artillery, which, in plain language, meant he was trained to be a forward observer. By the summer of 1944, he was a sergeant in Battery C of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, and he was 20 years old. On July 17, 1944, in the hedgerow country of Normandy, the lieutenant commanding Denius's observation team was killed by machine gun fire. Denius took over. He adjusted fire for the remainder of the engagement, accurately, under fire, and the infantry he was supporting held their position. His battalion commander's radio reply when rounds were on the way became the mantra of every observer in the unit. 2 words, on the way. Robert Weiss was born in New York in 1923. He had enlisted in the Army at age 20, been commissioned through OCS, and assigned to Battery B of the same 230th Field Artillery Battalion. By August of 1944, He had been in France for less than 2 months. He had brown hair and wore glasses, and had worked in a hardware store before the army found him. On August 7, 1944, Weiss was positioned on the high ground above the town of Mortain. His battalion had pre-registered barrage points on every road and field around the town. He had a radio. He had a clear line of sight southeast. And at 5:30 in the morning, when the German armor of the 2nd and the 2nd SS Panzer divisions began to move, he was awake and watching. What happened next needs to be understood against what Hitler had intended. Operation Luttich, the counterattack toward Avranches, was the Führer's personal order. 4 panzer divisions, 200-plus tanks, driving west through a 20-mile gap to reach the sea and cut off Patton's entire Third Army. If it succeeded, the Normandy campaign would be thrown into crisis. The supply lines for over 400,000 American soldiers depended on a single coastal road running through Avranches, and Avranches was only 20 miles from Mortain. The German armored commanders understood the risk. Several of them had argued against it. General Hans von Funk, who commanded the 47th Panzer Corps, had pushed back through channels. The terrain was wrong, the timing was wrong, and perhaps most importantly, the weather was wrong. American air power had been devastating in the clear skies of summer, and the Allies controlled the air completely. The attack needed fog to survive its opening hours. Von Funk had asked for a delay. He did not get one. The fog that appeared on August 7th was not the sustained cover the Germans needed. It lasted until mid-morning, and when it lifted, 2 things happened simultaneously. The first was that American and British aircraft, the P-47s and Typhoons that had been circling blind since dawn, found the German column and began systematically destroying it. The second was that Robert Weiss began to talk on the radio. By every rule of armored warfare the German commanders understood, the road through Mortain should have been open. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion's guns were positioned more than 5 miles behind the American line. They could not be located from the road. They could not be suppressed from the road. And they were firing, within minutes of the German column appearing in Weiss's observation zone, with an accuracy that made Hauptmann Kortenhaus's hands stop working properly. What Weiss was doing was straightforward by the standards of the system he had been trained in. He identified armor on the road south of town. He called in a concentration number. The FDC computed the data and transmitted it to the gun line. 12 105mm howitzers adjusted and fired for effect. He corrected. They adjusted. He called for sustained fire. They sustained. Then he called for more, because that is what the American system allowed. Weiss did not just have his own battalion. Through the FDC and the Artillery Coordination Net, a single forward observer in a good position with a working radio could request massed fire from additional battalions, division artillery, corps artillery, fire from guns he could not see and had never visited, operated by men who would never know his name. The FDC coordinated the additions. The fire came, all of it, when a time-on-target shoot was called, precisely synchronized so that the shells from every battalion landed within seconds of each other on the same grid reference. The Germans had no framework for processing what this meant. They knew there was artillery. They could hear it. They could see the effects. What they could not do was locate it, because a single observer calling from a foxhole on a hill did not produce the kind of signature they were trained to find. There were no large radio transmitters in the forward area. There was no visible fire direction element. There was simply, from their perspective, a sky that had decided to kill them, with no apparent mechanism and no apparent limit. Frank Denius had set up his observation post on the western slope of Hill 314, the high ground north of Mortain that would become one of the most contested pieces of terrain in the Normandy campaign. From that position, he could see south and southwest, toward the roads and fields where the main German thrust was developing. Lieutenant Charles Bartz held the eastern arc. Between the two of them, they covered almost the entire approach zone. Denius later described what it looked like from his position. The German column on the road below, moving fast, confident of the fog cover, unaware that above them on the hill 2 young men with radios were watching every vehicle. When he opened his first fire mission, the rounds walked in from the pre-registered concentration, and the column stopped moving. He adjusted, and then he called for everything he could get. While Lieutenant Weiss called in artillery on the east and southeast, Denius said afterward, I called it for the south and southwest. We laid a solid ring of fire on them. Their casualties and vehicle damage were incredible. That sentence does not capture what it looked like from the road. 782 German dead were eventually counted in front of the positions on the northern shoulder. The 238th and 58th Panzer Divisions lost dozens of vehicles in the first hours. Armored columns that had moved confidently through the pre-dawn dark were reduced to burning wreckage on roads they had expected to drive through uncontested. When the fog lifted and the aircraft arrived, the combination became something close to annihilation. The attack at Mortain failed. Operation Luttich failed. The panzer divisions that had been committed to breaking through to the sea were still fighting at Mortain when the Allied armies closed the Falaise pocket around them 4 days later. The counterattack that Hitler had ordered as the salvation of the Wehrmacht in the West had instead accelerated its destruction. And through all of it, on the hill above the town, with the German infantry eventually surrounding them and cutting off their supply line, Weiss and Denius and the men of the 230th kept talking on the radio. The battalion found a way to resupply them. They fired certain shells with the explosive charge removed and the casing repacked with medical supplies and rations. The hollow projectiles landed on the hillside and were recovered by the surrounded men. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion was using its guns to deliver medicine. When the position was finally relieved on August 12th, of the roughly 700 men who had been surrounded on the hill, more than 300 had been killed or wounded. The ones who survived came down looking, by all accounts, like men who had been living inside an explosion for 5 days, which is approximately what they had been doing. But now we need to ask the question that the Germans were asking in their after-action reports. Why could they not do this? The German army was not an army of fools. The Wehrmacht was, in many respects, the most tactically sophisticated ground force in the war. Its officers were trained on a doctrine of initiative, Auftragstaktik, mission command, that is still studied in military schools today. Its infantry and armor had been tested against every major European power and had not found their equal. And its field artillery, on a technical level, was genuinely excellent. The German 105mm LEFH-18 howitzer was a fine weapon. The 150mm SFH-18 was arguably superior to its American equivalent. German gunners were skilled, often highly skilled, and their ammunition, when they had it, was accurate. The gap was not in the guns. The gap was in the brain connecting the guns to the battlefield. German artillery was organized around the battery as the fundamental firing unit. A German forward observer, called a Beobachter, was assigned to support a specific battery. When he identified a target, his request went up to the battery commander. The battery commander computed his own firing data, made his own adjustments, and fired. If the observer needed fire from more than one battery, the request went higher, to the battalion level, and the battalion had to coordinate multiple separate sets of firing data, computed separately, adjusted separately. The process was not designed for speed. It was designed for accuracy, which the Germans valued, and for a kind of professional control that German artillery tradition had always prized. The battery commander was the master of his guns. He computed, he commanded, he fired. There is something admirable in that tradition, and it is worth saying so plainly. German battery commanders were technically excellent. The computation they performed was not rote execution. It was professional mastery. Their adjustments in the first shot were frequently more precise than American first shots, because the German observer and battery commander had a more intimate working relationship, built over time. German artillery at El Alamein, at Kursk, on the Chir River, had demonstrated what it could accomplish in the hands of skilled crews with sufficient ammunition. It was not a flawed weapon. It was a different philosophy of how a weapon should be used. But that philosophy had a cost that only became visible at scale, under time pressure. In a war where the side producing more guns and more shells and more observers had decided to use all of them at once. The American FDC stripped the computation from the individual battery commander and gave it to the battalion. The battery commanders became, in effect, gun operators executing data they had not calculated themselves. For German artillery officers who understood their tradition, this would have felt like a demotion. The battery commander's judgment, his professional mastery of his own weapons, was precisely what German doctrine celebrated. The American system asked him to set aside that mastery and trust a calculation made by a captain and 2 lieutenants in a tent behind the gun line. This is not a small thing. It is not a technical oversight. It is a philosophical difference about where expertise lives in an organization, and it connects to something much deeper in the German military tradition. There is also the question of ammunition. German artillery in Normandy was rationed more severely than almost any other factor in the campaign. The Wehrmacht's logistics had been breaking down since Stalingrad, and by the summer of 1944, the deterioration was acute. German batteries in France were frequently limited to a fixed number of rounds per day, regardless of the tactical situation. Higher command, not the battery commander, and certainly not the forward observer, made those allocation decisions. When a target appeared and an observer wanted to mass fire, the request traveled up a chain of command whose intermediate nodes were all asking the same question, namely, whether this target was worth the ammunition, before it traveled back down to the guns. The American system did not ask that question at the intermediate nodes. The forward observer made the request. The FDC allocated what was available. If the forward observer's target warranted 10 battalions, the FDC sought 10 battalions. The ammunition accounting happened afterward, not before. But there is a second layer to this, and it is the layer that actually killed the Germans at Mortain. Even if the Wehrmacht had possessed an equivalent to the FDC, they could not have used it the way the Americans did. Because using it the way the Americans did required trusting a 20-year-old sergeant in a foxhole to make fire support decisions that, in the German system, would have required a field-grade officer. Denius was a sergeant. He was calling fire from multiple battalions. In German doctrine, a request of that scale would have required coordination through the regimental artillery liaison, then the divisional artillery commander, and potentially the corps artillery officer. Each layer adding time, each layer adding the possibility that someone would decide the request was excessive or the target did not justify the ammunition expenditure. German artillery in Normandy was rationed. The Wehrmacht was suffering chronic ammunition shortages by the summer of 1944, and German higher command often limited batteries to a fixed number of rounds per mission, regardless of what the situation on the ground required. A sergeant on a hill requesting sustained, massed fire from multiple battalions would have been, in the German system, making a request that no sergeant could make. The system did not allow it. The American system was built around a different assumption. The man closest to the target was the man most qualified to decide what the target needed. His rank did not determine the scale of the response. The situation did. If the situation required 12 battalions, the FDC would try to give him 12 battalions. And if the forward observer was 20 years old and had been a hardware store clerk 9 months ago, that was fine, because the hardware store clerk had been trained, specifically and thoroughly, to do exactly this. The captured German map story from the Bulge period captures this precisely. American intelligence, through what channel is not fully recorded, obtained a map showing the positions of all German artillery in a given sector. The map was passed to American Division Artillery. Division Artillery computed a time-on-target shoot for every position on the map simultaneously. The shells from multiple battalions arrived at every German battery position within seconds of each other, before any battery could displace or take cover. No other army in the war could have done that. Not the British, who had a similar but slower system. Not the Soviets, whose artillery was massed but blunt. Certainly not the Germans, whose batteries fired independently and whose requests passed through command layers that would have taken longer to coordinate than the time it took the American shells to fly. At Elsenborn Ridge in December of 1944, on the northern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive, the Americans massed roughly 348 guns under a single fire coordination headquarters. When German armor hit Company A of the 26th Infantry, the American artillery responded to the call in 3 minutes, and eventually 7 battalions joined the fire mission. German graves registration later counted 782 dead in front of the American positions from those engagements, along with the wreckage of 47 tanks. On December 22nd alone, 1944, American artillery fired 10,000 rounds into German assault formations at Dom-Buchenbach. Not a single Panzer grenadier reached the American foxholes. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in a letter written from Normandy in the summer of 1944, the last summer of his life, described the effect of Allied artillery on German operations with a flatness that is almost more devastating than anger would have been. The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, he wrote, and even more in the air, has broken the front open. He understood it. He could not fix it. General Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Lehr division was effectively destroyed by American artillery and air power at Saint-Lô in July of 1944, described his positions afterward as a moon landscape, with the bomb craters touching rim to rim. He said his men were lying in their holes, still and mute, because they were dead. He said this not in anger or exaggeration, but as a tactical assessment. His front no longer existed. German prisoners taken in the summer of 1944 were unanimous, according to a U.S. Field Artillery School compilation published in January of 1945, in their grudging admiration for what American artillery was doing to them. They described helplessness. They described panic. They described men paralyzed and unable to function under sustained fire from weapons they could not find and could not silence. Some of the prisoners, according to accounts from Anzio and later from Normandy, asked to be shown the American automatic cannons. They had concluded, rationally, that the only explanation for the volume and continuity of American fire was that the guns must be automatic. A normal howitzer required a crew to load and fire each round. What they were experiencing could not, by their calculations, be coming from normal howitzers. So there must be, somewhere, a cannon that loaded and fired itself. There were no automatic cannons. There was a 22-year-old forward observer and a radio and a fire direction center in a tent 5 miles back, running firing data on a plotting board. Here is what the Germans were actually looking at. Not superior weapons, not larger shells, not more battalions, though the Americans did often have more of those. They were looking at a system that had collapsed the distance between the man who could see the target and the guns that could destroy it. They were looking at an institution that had chosen to trust its youngest officers with decisions that every other army in the war reserved for senior commanders. They were looking at the military expression of something that the American system did in 1944 better than almost anyone else on Earth. It identified a problem, built an organizational solution, gave that solution to the men closest to the problem, and then trusted them to use it. The Germans could not copy it. Not for lack of trying to understand it. They interrogated American prisoners. They captured American manuals. They knew, in outline, how the Fire Direction Center worked. But building a system like it would have required dismantling a set of assumptions about where authority lives in a military organization, assumptions that ran back through generations of Prussian and German military tradition. The battery commander was the master of his guns. The senior officer coordinated the fire. The sergeant executed. He did not decide. Giving a sergeant the authority to mass the fire of 12 battalions was not a technical adjustment. It was a revolution in how the German army understood command itself. And revolutions of that kind do not happen while a war is being lost. There is a line that comes out of the winter of 1944 from German after-action reports on the Ardennes offensive that has stayed with historians who study this period. It does not appear in the dispatch of any general. It comes from a lieutenant in a Volksgrenadier division who had been fighting since 1941 and who survived the Bulge and wrote about it afterward. He was trying to explain to someone who had not been there what it felt like to be on the receiving end of American artillery at Elsenborn. He wrote that you could not find where it was coming from. You could not silence it. You could not predict when it would arrive or what it would hit next. He wrote that after enough hours of it, men stopped being soldiers and started being animals looking for a hole to crawl into. And then he wrote something that has no equivalent in any American account of that period, because the Americans who were on the firing end of this never felt what he felt. He wrote that it seemed, after a while, as though the decision of what to destroy had been taken entirely out of human hands. Franklin Denius came home from the war in 1945. He had 4 silver stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star. He enrolled at the University of Texas, studied law, and built a legal career in Austin that lasted decades. He was quiet about the war for a long time, the way most of them were quiet. And then, in his later years, he began to talk about it, carefully, to people who asked careful questions. He was asked once what it had felt like, on the hill above Mortain, to call fire from that position, to be 20 years old and directing that much destruction at that range, and to know that what he was doing was working. He said it felt like the most important thing he had ever been asked to do, and like the smallest he had ever felt while doing it. He said the guns were enormous, and he was a voice on a radio, and the distance between those two things was the whole system. Robert Weiss came home and wrote a memoir about Hill 314. He called it Fire Mission, the words that opened every call to the guns. He spent the rest of his life trying to explain to people who had not been there what it had meant to be on that hill, with the Germans below and around and eventually above, with the radio keeping them alive in a way that no rifle or machine gun could have. The radio was the lifeline. The FDC was the promise. The guns were the answer. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wyman, who commanded the 230th Field Artillery Battalion throughout that fight, said afterward that the system his battalion used at Mortain was simply the system they had been trained in. There was nothing improvised about it. Every battery knew its job. The FDC knew its job. The observers knew their job. The parts fit together because people at Fort Sill had spent 15 years making sure the parts fit together before any of them had heard of Mortain. Major Orlando Ward, who built the Fire Direction Center at Fort Sill between 1932 and 1934, never served in combat during the Second World War. He commanded a division in North Africa in 1943, was relieved after the Kasserine Pass debacle, and spent the rest of the war in staff roles. He did not see his creation used at Elsenborn or at Mortain, but the system he designed outlived every argument about his own performance. It survived into Korea and Vietnam and the Gulf War, and it is still, in its essential architecture, the way American artillery is coordinated today. The German Hauptmann Werner Kortenhaus, the man in the Panther tank who watched the column die around him on the road south of Mortain, survived the war. He wrote about what he had seen, and his account is one of the cleaner windows into what it felt like to be inside a column when American artillery had a clear view of it and a working radio connection to the guns. He did not call it the hand of God. He did not use any phrase that grandiose. He simply said that he had never, in all his years of war, felt as powerless as he felt on that road on that morning. And that powerlessness, that specific and documented and historically verifiable feeling, was not an accident of terrain or weather or misfortune. It was the product of a decision made by a major in Oklahoma more than a decade before the war. A decision to centralize the computation of fire and decentralize the authority to request it, to trust the man closest to the target with the power to destroy it. Think about what that actually means. The American artillery system was not built for the Second World War. It was built in a classroom during peacetime by men who had never seen the hedgerows of Normandy and could not have imagined the Ardennes in December. They built it because they looked at the problem of massing artillery fire and concluded that the bottleneck was not the guns, and not the crews, and not the shells. The bottleneck was time. Every minute lost between the observer's eyes and the gun's muzzles was a minute in which infantry died, armor advanced, and the enemy positioned himself more favorably for the next exchange. Shorten that minute, and you change the mathematics of every engagement. Make the response fast enough, and the forward observer stops being a man watching events and becomes a man controlling them. The lieutenant on the Elsenborn Ridge had felt that shift from the other side. The shells arriving with no warning were not a miracle. They were the downstream consequence of a 15-year institutional decision to value speed of response over senior officer control. They were what happened when a system trusted a sergeant. One artillery observation, one radio call, one FDC, 12 guns, 3 minutes. The Germans never found the man in the hole. Now you know why it mattered that he was there. If someone in your family served in the artillery in the Second World War, I want to hear about them in the comments. The forward observers and the battery crews and the FDC operators are not the names that appear in most history books. But without them, the war in the West looks very different. Every one of those men carried a story. If you know one of those stories, tell it below. And if this video reached you, a subscription helps the next one reach someone else who is still looking for it.